We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
This is Oz Davis, host of the Truly the Goats podcast. For episode 11, I interviewed author Denis Crawford. Denis is the writer of 3 books, based in part at least on professional football in Tampa, Florida. His third and most recently released book is the autobiographical work, The Life and Teams of Johnny F. Bassett, published by McFarland. The following is my entire unexpurgated interview with Denis. Well, okay, not completely unexpurgated. I took out a couple of added a couple of transitional scratches, but it's very close. Enjoy. Denis Crawford, thanks for joining us on Truly the Goats.
It is an honor to have been invited.
No, an honor. Thank you very much. Let's get right into it. Tell me about your first 2 books and about this third book, The Life and Teams of Johnny F. Bassett.
My first book was on the 1979 Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It was called McKay's Men, and it was all about their first playoff team, how they went from worst to first. And then I did a follow-up book also on the Buccaneers called Hugh Culverhouse and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, because I discovered that even though the team was awful, their owner was a fascinating man, deeply flawed, not a good football owner, but just an amazing mover and shaker in the NFL. And I did not realize how much power he wielded in the NFL. So that was my second book. And then for Bassett, I just, kind of remembered the Bandits. My goal was to write a history of the Bandits, but then I realized I wanted to write a book about the Bandits because they were a fun team and they were my first true sports love because I was there. I remember their inception. I remember when Burt Reynolds was on TV telling everybody to come and buy Bandit tickets. And I remember, those were the first pro football games I ever went to, were USFL games, and seeing the lone horseman come riding in, shooting off his gun, and Jim Neighbors, Gomer Pyle is down there singing the national anthem. And so I was like, oh, I got to tell the story of this team. And then I realized the man who owned them was the star. He was the story. He was going to carry this book. And I just did more and more digging, and I realized that the Bandits were like the culmination of 15 years of effort on his part to create a new kind of professional sports team. And then also there's just like that Greek tragedy part of it, that, the Bandits died as he died. I was like, my goodness, you couldn't, a Hollywood scriptwriter wouldn't have been able to create somebody like Johnny F. Bassett. He had to have just been born, so that's where I went. I wanted to learn as much about this maverick as I could, and hopefully people will enjoy his story, because I think people will find themselves in all of his efforts.
PR material for your book calls Bassett one of the most influential sportsmen of the late 20th century. Now, I realize you don't write the press material for your own work. However, can you expound upon that statement a little bit, especially given that Bassett never really played on any professional level?
Yes. By influence, what I mean is, did he make or instigate change? And from that regard, Johnny F. Bassett did. All though his teams never won a playoff series or won a championship of any kind, the modern NFL and NHL were forever altered by the efforts he put into upstart leagues. We have teams playing hockey in cities such as Tampa Bay and Dallas and Raleigh, North Carolina. If Bassett doesn't prove that he can sell hockey in Birmingham, Alabama, then I don't know that those teams are there today. The Buccaneers in Tampa have a pirate-themed football stadium now. It's like you walk into a Pirates of Caribbean set when you go to a Buccaneers game. In the 1980s, Bassett brought to Tampa showmanship. He brought Hollywood to Tampa in the way of Burt Reynolds as his co-owner, inviting Lonnie Anderson to be part of the marketing team, playing up the Smokey and the Bandit genre of his co-owner, so that when you went to a Bandits game, it was almost like walking into a Hollywood set. So that's the influence that we get to.
You compare and contrast in your book Bassett and P.T. Barnum. Now, of course, this is an old comparison. I mean, even in the book, you quote Bassett's son as saying that people called him the Canadian Barnum. What's that comparison in brief?
Well, Barnum has a bit of a mythology about him. It's one of those things where it's apocryphal, and I don't know that it's accurate that he really did say there's a sucker born every minute. But he did sell humbug. He sold spectacle. Whether you're talking about claiming that Josie Heth was a 118-year-old nursemaid of George Washington when he put her on display, or any of the amazing things he put in the American Museum, he was selling an experience to his audience and leaving it up to you to determine whether or not it was factual. And Bassett, in the beginning of his career, was viewed as a Barnum-esque figure. I found that a little unfair in that he wasn't selling humbug. He wasn't conning people, so to speak, the way that Barnum could, but he was trying to sell sports as spectacle. He felt that the ticket buyer deserved more than just a game for the price of their admission. They deserved a full sensory experience.
Bassett's first foray into the world of professional sports management was his sort of attempt to organize an Indy car race within Toronto city limits, including laps, I guess, around the Toronto Argonaut Stadium. Tell us in brief how that went.
It did not go well. It was Bassett's first introduction to the labyrinthine nature of civic politics in Toronto at that time. Ontario had built a wonderful facility just outside of the city limits called Mo Sports, where IndyCar races were being held. But Bassett saw a Grand Prix style race held in Montreal and decided, I want something like that for the city of Toronto. Toronto is a barren sports landscape when the Leafs are not playing. This is in the 60s, so you have Toronto Maple Leaf hockey, you got the Argonauts, and then Bassett says you have 7 months of nothing else. And so he wanted to bring spectacle to the lakeshore. So he worked with various friends of his. They formed a small industry called Lakeshore Racing, and he established a 2.5-mile serpentine course right along the lakeshore of Toronto, including having not just going around Exhibition Stadium, but having the cars race over the playing surface of Exhibition Stadium. And many of his fellow citizens of Toronto were appalled by this, because you're going to take away our parklands and you're going to have this loud auto race just down the road from people's houses, and you're contravening the Lord's day. And Bassett's really trying his best to satisfy everything, saying, oh no, we're going to hold it later in the day. I'm not going to stop people from getting to church on time. It's completely safe. It's only this one day of the year. We're going to be able to bring 250,000 people here. It'll be a great show. And he just slowly loses each battle going forward. And I think he becomes relatively chastened by the experience. You know, he had hosted a couple of races. He and his father with the Toronto Telegram hosted the IndyCar races at Mo Sport. So this kills off his dream of a big race. And what's ironic is that shortly after Bassett dies in 1986, a course very similar to that is instituted, and I believe it's the Molson race. But shortly after Bassett dies in 1986, a course similar to the one he designed is used for an IndyCar race on the lake shore of Toronto, and they actually award a trophy in his name to the winner of the race. So this is another example of his influence. He was just too far ahead of his time. The politics of Toronto in the 1960s had not caught up to somebody with that level of sporting imagination. But in 1986, Toronto had grown more cosmopolitan. You have the Blue Jays as well as the Leafs. You have a burgeoning race enthusiasts. You know, the Mo Sports Auto Park is used even more. It just took a while for the city to catch up with Bassett.
Yeah, since Bassett's time, Toronto has won 2 World Series and 1 NBA championship. The Leafs may finally be becoming relevant again, and the Argonauts, who were the big draw, are almost irrelevant now. Quite a flip there in Toronto sports history. Bassett loses $4, $5, $6 million on the Toronto/Birmingham hockey experiment. When the WHA merges into the NHL, his team is not chosen to merge. Would you consider his tenure in that league a success or a failure?
I would consider him to be like Apollo 13 in that he was a successful failure. Financially, he took quite a beating, although he became whole at the end. When the NHL and WHA merged, those teams that were not invited along did receive financial settlements, and those settlements helped him not only pay off the debts he accumulated with the Toros and Bulls, but also those he was still carrying over from his World Football League adventure. Now, the reason why I say successful as opposed to failure is because he did prove some very important points. He did prove that even in Toronto, the spiritual center of hockey in English-speaking Canada, it would support a second team. Attendance wasn't really a problem. He was getting close to 10,000 per game in Toronto. The issue was not being able to find an arena of his own. He was willing to put money into the CNE Center. He was willing to work with developers to try and find a suitable place in Toronto so that the Toros could have a home of their own, because paying an exorbitant amount of rent to Harold Ballard to play at Maple Leaf Gardens was just a crushing commitment that over time drove him out of the city. So his belief that the city could support 2 teams was bearing out. The infrastructure of the city couldn't support 2 teams at that time. The fan base could. And he was also accurate in his belief that a European style of play would appeal. The NHL at that time was very limited athletically, said the man who cannot skate, but it was still a lot of clutching and grabbing and the broad street bullies and physical intimidation and neutral zone traps. But The WHA really wanted a free-flowing style and also invited a lot of European players to come and play. European players were looked down upon at the time by the NHL as being too finesse-oriented and not physical enough. And Bassett reaches out and brings Vaclav Nedomansky and Richard Farda from Czechoslovakia. He helps them defect to Canada to bring their style of play. He helps open up the Canadian juniors. The NHL had an agreement where they would not sign these 16 to 20-year-old Canadian junior players. It was actually Colleen Howe, Gordie Howe's wife, who found a loophole that allowed Marty and Mark Howe to play for the Houston Aeros. And once that loophole was opened, Bassett dove through with both feet and was signing as many of members of the Toronto Marlboros, the junior team, the very popular junior team in Toronto, also known as the Marlies, getting Wayne Dillon to sign. Wayne Dillon, people had been dreaming about what it would be like when Wayne Dillon would finally put on a maple leaf sweater, and Johnny Bassett swoops in and puts a Toro sweater on him instead. And Dillon ends up being a very productive player at an amazingly young age. So Bassett is successful in that regard, and he moves to Birmingham, and people are laughing. It's, how can you move to Birmingham? How are you going to sell hockey in the seat of the Confederacy, of all places? The Atlanta Flames are struggling. They'll eventually move to Calgary. You cannot sell hockey to this audience, and Bassett just accepts it as a personal challenge. And within 2 years, you've got 12,000 people with very thick Southern accents going, "That's icing!" Or, chanting defense. Johnny Bassett, his son, also John Bassett, was claiming this is the first time he'd ever gone to a hockey game and heard people chanting defense like they were at a Crimson Tide game. And so Bassett proves that he's right again. The failure is that Bassett's proving that he's right alienates him from many of the powers that be in the NHL, particularly Harold Ballard, who was the owner of the Toronto Maple Leafs. He took market share away from Harold Ballard, and you don't do that to Harold Ballard. You don't take money out of his pocket and expect to have a long and fruitful life in hockey. And so Bassett's not invited to join the merged leagues. So in that way, it's a failure because Bassett doesn't get the ultimate prize of an NHL franchise. But I'm thinking as a romantic and as somebody who loves these kinds of stories, he was really successful because now the NHL is in the South, and 18-year-olds and Europeans do regularly play in the NHL. And so it's a successful failure.
A lot of Bassett's ventures involved placing a second team in a major city. When he tried to get a stake in the World Football League, he put in the Toronto Northmen, and thus, as you put it in your book, touched off this wave of anti-Americanism among some Canadian politicians. But did the national government have an argument vis-a-vis the Toronto Northmen versus the CFL?
Well, first off, let me break that down into the component parts. I would say that it's not so much that Bassett wanted to always go head-to-head when there was another team in town. It's because he was a passionate citizen of those places he called home. He was a native Torontonian. He loved Toronto. He adored that city, and he just felt it deserved better sports-wise. He felt it deserved the auto race. He felt it deserved an American-style football team because it would get people excited. He felt that, the Maple Leafs had their place, but that there was an underserved population in Toronto who wanted a different style of hockey, and he was ready to give it to them. So I don't think he was necessarily trying to be a pain in the ass to entrenched teams. He truly loved Toronto, and he regularly vacationed in Tampa. They lived just south of Tampa part-time of the year for many years. So it's not so much he wanted to challenge the Buccaneers as he loved Tampa. And so he felt Tampa really deserved to be in on this exciting ground floor opportunity. But getting back to the second part of your question, the Canadian government had a point to a degree in that the CFL was a very carefully balanced structure. The CFL at one time, up until I'd say the late 1950s, was on par with the National Football League. They often competed for the same players, and sometimes when an NFL player would get tired of their contract, they would play it out and jump to Canada, and some Canadian players would do the same thing. And so there was a level of equity between the two leagues, and they had to, they even crafted a non-aggression pact during that time when Sam the Rifle Echeverry, it looked like he was going to leave the Canadian League and go play for the Chicago Cardinals, and that was setting off shockwaves. We get to the 1960s, Pete Rozelle figures out television. We have the merger of the AFL and NFL. The Super Bowl becomes an unofficial national holiday. All of a sudden, NFL is viewed as being a far superior league, and American-style football is viewed as being a very, very superior style. To the point that at one time the Canadian Rugby Union refused to allow forward passes because it would make us look too American. So when you get to the 70s and Bassett is unveiling the Toronto Northmen, who are going to play an American style of football, and he has signed 3 members of the back-to-back Super Bowl champion Dolphins to play for this franchise, a lot of teams in Canada are very worried. Because, as I mentioned, there's a very special balance. The teams that are largely in the western provinces, Calgary and the British Columbia Lions and Edmonton, are largely non-profit organizations, very similar to the Green Bay Packers. Whereas you get the teams in the eastern provinces, the Toronto Argonauts and the Montreal Alouettes. They're for-profit in major media centers, and the money that they make is split evenly with the teams out west. It was a process called gate equalization. And if Toronto's Argonauts are now going to compete with an American-style football team, the CFL is scared that that's going to impact the amount of money the Argonauts make per year. And if the Argonauts make less money, the CFL makes less money. And so there's a financial stake there. Marc Lalonde, Pierre Trudeau's Minister of Health and Welfare, also argues that because Canadian football is the only sport played in Canada that is uniquely Canadian, that it needs to be protected. And so he and several members of Parliament, mostly representing the provinces in which there are the non-profit CFL teams, craft a bill called the Canadian Football League Act, which was actually going to outlaw American-style football. And it was strictly to prevent Johnny Bassett and his team from establishing a foothold in Toronto.
All right. It's elephant in the room time.
Okay.
I guess almost literally elephant in the room. So much has been written about the USFL and specifically what led to the demise of the USFL, which by all accounts, many, many, many millions of Americans loved very much, myself among them, yourself among them, being young folks at the time. Why this failed, the backroom machinations, the overexpansion, whatever. There's been a million ways to talk about this. There's been a million things said about this. So I'm just going to give you 3 words and you can go. Bassett versus Trump.
Well, I've always loathed to talk too much about Trump.
Gee, why?
In the last 5 years, he has tended to. I'm not making a political statement. Everybody's politics are their own, but even whether you're a diehard Republican or a die-in-the-wool Democrat, you have to admit the man sucks all the oxygen out of every topic. But you cannot tell the history of the USFL without Bassett v. Trump. You also cannot look at those battles and not think 30 years later the entire nation is going to be engaged in similar style battles during the Trump presidency. There were lies, truth misrepresented, and half-lies all throughout this battle. Donald Trump comes into the league in 1984. He purchases the New Jersey Generals because the owner of the team, J. Walter Duncan, just wants out. He's an Oklahoma oil man, and he has no interest really in staying in New Jersey. He only took the franchise to help the league get started. And Bassett is a big believer in a salary cap, in establishing spring as the season. We build our business slowly, and over a few years, we will eventually get to the point where the NFL will have to absorb some of us and let us be NFL teams, or allow us to continue in the spring, but somehow come in under the NFL umbrella as some kind of a minor league system or feeder system. Trump comes in and immediately wants to move the entire operation to the fall and compete head-to-head, believing that he could force the merger much more quickly and increase the value of all of the clubs. And so that fundamental difference between the two is always going to be at the heart of it. But what a lot of people don't appreciate and don't want to give enough credit for is the fact that Trump was not always an enemy of Bassett. The two of them actually had a lot in common. And I know that made some people I interviewed uncomfortable when I would point that out, but they're both the scions of very successful fathers. Donald Trump's dad was a millionaire. Bassett's dad was a millionaire. They both were brought up in large empires, so to speak. They're both brash. They both know how to turn a quote. They both know how to get on both the front page and the back page of newspapers. Where they differ, though, is on their fundamental operating philosophy. Bassett was very blunt and honest and a straight shooter and always put the league first, whereas Trump was brash, would pretty much say anything that needed to be said to get his way, and would stab you in the back at the minute he felt you were of no more use to him. And so that starts this divide, because originally Bassett was very excited to see Trump come into the USFL because he saved the New York area franchise. And you cannot have a major sports league in the United States unless you have a significant presence in the New York area. And if Trump didn't come in, the USFL was going to lose that franchise. So they're friendly at first. But then when Trump starts advocating for getting rid of spring play, getting rid of salary caps, that's where it turns sideways.
The name of the book is The Life and Teams of Johnny F. Bassett, author Denis Crawford. Thanks for coming on to Truly the Goats.
Well, thank you very much for your time. And I just want it to be said that Johnny F. Bassett was a dreamer, but he was a very practical dreamer. And I think we all owe a debt of gratitude for those people who didn't necessarily win on the field, but without whose efforts the games we love to watch today would be radically less than what they could have been.
This has been an extra edition of Truly the Goats, a Sports History Network podcast. Thanks again to our guest, Denis Crawford. His latest book, The Life and Teams of Johnny Bassett, is available at mcfarlandpub.com. Our theme song is Fun on Street, greatest remix of all time, produced by David Liso of Dynamo Stairs. This is Oz Davis for the Truly the Goats podcast. Until next time, stay healthy and stay historical.
At the Sports History Network, we're all about sports yesteryear, and so we're so pleased to introduce you to Row One, an online memorabilia gallery and shop that brings your sports history to life anywhere. The Row One gallery includes over 5,200 gorgeously reproduced prints of team posters, game program covers, game tickets, advertisements, and more in baseball, pro and college football, pro and college basketball, and more. And any gallery item may be printed in a variety of sizes on wood, metal, canvas, acrylic, or poster paper. And in Row One shop, check out the thousands more of unique items with a retro and historical designs dating back to 1876, including t-shirts, long sleeve shirts, phone cases, mugs, blankets, pillows, towels, and even shower curtains. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com, ROW1, for access to the full Row One catalog and for gallery prints and gift items, plus get a 15% discount off all prints on the Row One Pictorium Gallery with coupon code SHN15. Follow the link on the show notes.